Fate, Souls and Singularities by Mundatorem Chapter 39-40. Chapter 39, Siege Dancer. Vanguard Pav. Goff pulled back the string of his bow, the giant arrow was aimed towards its target. The giant tensed his breathing before he released the projectile. There was a clap of thunder accompanying the release of the arrow as the sound barrier was shattered. Within scant few seconds the giant's aim rang true. The front gate, or the amalgamation of spider webs that had replaced it, had been obliterated in the single strike. Goff nodded his head. Thy way is clear. Make haste at once. He called out as he for another arrow. Arash stood next to him with a blank expression, looking down at his own bow and then back at the giant. Huh. Definitely louder than I thought it would be. He mused, then let out a brief chuckle as he pulled back his own bow. I'll begin providing support. I can already see a few spiders and what looks like spiders embedded in the backs of the soldiers, so be ready for that. Understood. Ritska grimaced, holding back a flinch as he turned to Mash, Olga and Nero. Goff has cleared the way into the city, but Arash says that the spiders are already out. Swallowing his bile, he cringed in disgust. He says they are embedded in the people. Nero gave a similar expression, soon followed by rage. To think that they would dare dirty my people so. Growling, she thrust her sword towards the fort, the blade becoming coated in fire. Forward, my Romans. For Rome. For Rome. Came the accompanying cry as the legion charged forwards, the Chaldean masters leading from the front with Mash and Nero acting as they frontline fighters. Ritska caught a flash in the air before it looked as if lances of light were raining down from the sky onto the buildings. He smiled. Good shooting, Arash. No problem, this the kind of stuff I'm good for. Hold up. There was a noticeable frown in Arash's voice. I can just about make something out. Looks like something is happening in the center of the town. Any details? Sorry, Master. Not a lot I can see, it's obscured by some kind of fog. Alright, thanks for the heads up. Turning his head to the others, Arash said he can see some kind of ritual happening in the center of the town. They must have already started then. Olga nodded her head as she jogged alongside him. We'll need to punch through there. Then we shall move at once. Nero proclaimed, dashing forwards, with me. Is she? Olga gaped in shock. Doesn't she have a mind for strategy? She just ran forward straight towards the enemies without even waiting for backup. Director. Ritska turned to her with a serious expression. I think the Emperor just is what she wants. That does sound like Nero-san. Mash affirmed, awkwardly scratching the back of her neck. She seems very confident. Olga released a sigh before shaking her head. Berserker. Crying out, her armored servant came lumbering towards the pair, the horned counterpart following it, provide her support and clear a path through to the center of the city. The dragon slayer armor let out a metallic groan before it turned on its heel, facing the direction of the ruins of the city gate before it charged forwards. There was a slight rumbling accompanying its steps as it sprinted across the battlefield, soon passing Nero, who let out a brief squeak in surprise, followed by another as the second berserker passed her as well. The Romans got to within a few hundred meters of the city gates before thousands of spiders came charging forth. Shields. Vespasian called out. The Romans ground to a halt, thrusting their shields forwards and creating a wall. Stand firm. Another clap of thunder soon accompanied an explosion of dirt and body parts as another of Goff's arrows slammed into the central line of the charging spiders, soon followed by hundreds of arrows from Arash. The two archers working in tandem as they picked off the charging creatures. Vespasian let out a shaky breath as he watched the assault barely make it to his men. Servants Pav. Thou art impressive. Goff rumbled as he took aim with another arrow. Thee makes up for in quantity what thou lacks in power. I can't really comment on power. Arash joked as Goff loosened another arrow. Arash held back a small flinch at the sonic boom, but you certainly live up to what I would expect of an archer. Those shots are actually pretty damn accurate too. I was granted the title of Hawkeye. The giant replied with a small chuckle. I even once shot down a dragon while blind. Oh. Arash pulled back his bow, swiftly loosening 100 arrows into the sky, soon raining down on the spiders which had left the bounds of the city. That sounds like a pretty good achievement to me. 'Tis only natural. He paused, lowering his bow. I can do no more, they are too close to the arachnids to safely aim. Don't worry about it. Arash reassured, you did a heck of a good job already. I'm sure there might be more for you to do. One can only hope. Ash brought his sword down, stabbing through the spider that had jumped at him and pinning it to the ground, blade still embedded in the dirt. He span on his heel whilst thrusting his left hand forwards. Chaos pyromancy exploded in his hand, letting loose a blast into the face of another spider. Ripping his blade free, he swung his body in a clockwise fashion, cutting through another dozen attackers. A ball of fire shot over his head, crashing into a small group of the familiars. Looking over his shoulder, he saw Quelaag tighten her hand into a fist before swinging it forwards. A rope of fire shot forth before tensing itself, spinning the makeshift whip over her head. She then cracked it into the ground. The glowing lines then exploded outwards in a wall of fire, burning through their attackers. Ash turned around and waved his hand over, advance. We've broken through this section. The Romans tensely nodded their heads, still keeping their eyes on Quelaag but quickly composing themselves as they marched through the breach in the wall. I'm surprised none of them have accidentally stabbed me. Quelaag mused with a smirk. Ash let out an incredulous huff as he marched past her, casually stomping on the head of one of the arachnids. The armor-plated skin shattered underfoot and let out a crunching sound as he marched over it. Do not sound too excited about such things. Ash replied, it would be most awkward for all involved. TCH. Quelaag clicked her tongue, you're no fun. Can't even get enjoyment out of riling you up. Nor would you wish to. The unkindled replied, backhanding a spider away before he raised his left hand. The fire in his pyromancer glove intensified before he slammed it into the ground. Pillars of fire shot up in a radius around them, burning through several opponents and sending the others hissing and reeling. Not bad. Quelaag commented with small shrug, although not all that good either. You're a bit of an amateur. I've only known pyromancy for a few weeks, perhaps a month. What do you expect of me? Of course you undead are all like that. The Chaos Witch scowled. Spent years crafting a spell to work just right and then some undead comes along and can just cast it like it's nothing with a few tries. Ash paused, throwing an orb of fire at a nearby spider before facing the demon. I would hardly consider it a few tries, and it really isn't my fault that unkindled are able to learn new skills quickly. Faye, you would think so, wouldn't you? On the other side of the city, Verndari slammed his shield into the face of an accursed. The beast went reeling backwards from the blow, several teeth being knocked from its multifaceted jaw. My liege, there are more of the abominations present. He warned over the link as he moved to advance. The accursed leapt up into the sky, spewing forth gray liquid from its mouth. Verndari clicked his tongue and jumped backwards as the fluid splashed across the ground. There was a sizzling sound as the dirt floor soon began to crack and melt. The nearby grass began to wither and die in mere moments. They spew forth curses, be warned. Appreciate the warning. He allowed himself a small smile. To be back on the front lines and in such an engagement was somewhat nostalgic to him. It was simple, he obeyed his orders and ensured they were carried out. He composed himself, putting his shield out in front of him as the accursed charged again. Digging his heels into the ground, he met the blow with a small shockwave. The ground beneath his feet cracked but he was not pushed backwards. Gritting his teeth, Verndari slowly began to push forwards, ensuring that the accursed could not get around him. Coming through. Came a cry from his right. His eyes briefly wandered in that direction to see Gareth charging towards him, Sif already having the sword in his mouth and his eyes firmly placed on the accursed. Verndari nodded to them, then thrust his shield upwards, slamming it into the chin of the abomination and sending it stumbling backwards. Sif was quick to take advantage, sliding to a stop and spinning around. the greatsword in the wolf's mouth glided through the air and effortlessly cut through the rightmost legs below the second knee with little effort. The accursed let out a cry of pain as it fell to its side, Gareth cracking a self-assured grin as she thrust her lance forwards into the side of the beast's head. The blue detonation soon followed from the weapon, jolting her arm back and sending half the accursed head flying off in all directions as it slumped over. Good work, Sif. Gareth beamed, rubbing the wolf behind the ears, much to the enjoyment of the pseudo-steed. Craning her head to look over at Verndari, she gave him a nod. Returning the gesture, he looked behind him to the Roman detachment he had taken command of. Keep advancing and watch the buildings for ambushes. Turning back around, he continued to march forwards as Sif spun around and sprinted off further into the city, slashing away at the spiders and their hosts while Gareth thrust her lance forwards at the occasional hostile. My liege, we have secured passage through the eastern wall. He sent the message over the link. How goes your offensive through the central gate? Masters Pav, Ritska, Mash, Olga and Nero all stared blankly at the front gate. Or what remained of it. The master had barely heard Verndari's question as the two berserkers laid waste to everything that was in their path. Ritska considered it somewhat therapeutic. Are all berserkers like that? He asked the director. The woman was also staring blankly at the carnage. Normally. No. Romani's voice came in. There are only a few exceptions to this. Most of the time the berserkers can only stand on equal with the other classes because of the madness enhancement. Leaning back into his chair, he whistled, although this is something else. Director, you summoned a pretty good servant. Resting the shield on his back, the dragon slayer armor gripped its axe with two hands. The left hand resting along the grip at the back of the blade before it slammed the weapon into the ground at an angle, the bladed side facing the ground before it dragged it along the floor, storming through and trampling spiders underfoot before it ripped its weapon free from the ground. Along with a sizable chunk of debris, most of which began raining down on the spiders and multiple houses. Most impressive. Nero nodded her head, then winced as the horned berserker punched an accursed in the face with enough force that the skull imploded and sent the corpse flying off and through a storehouse, although I would prefer that there remains a city to rebuild when we are victorious. It's not that bad. Ritska tried his best to run damage control. We still have a wall. He finished with a wince. It could be worse. Nero turned her head to stare blankly at him for few moments before she slowly nodded her head. I suppose that is true. An ear-piercing scream cut across the battlefield. There was a brief lull in the combat as the shriek echoed out. The masters and Nero turned their heads in the direction of the shout. The two berserkers also halted their movements, slowly turning their heads towards the source of the warcry. The dragon slayer armor held its shield out in front of itself in a protective manner while the smelter demon turned its body to face the new opponent, gripping its greatsword with two hands and releasing a menacing growl as the flames within its chest intensified. Wasn't that? Ritska made to identify the sound before the building in front of them exploded outwards. A wave of ice soon followed suit. Olga's berserker slammed its shield into the ground, shattering the frozen spikes that rushed towards it. The smelter demon leapt into the air to avoid them, landing atop the wall nearby with a growl. The sound of thumping soon followed as Vort crawled out of the blizzard. The berserker's servant stared at the dragon slayer armor and then towards the smelter demon. It growled before it threw back its head and let out another roar. Berserker! Olga called out. Attack! The two berserkers charged at the same time. Vort raced across the ground like a dog while the dragon slayer armor leapt forwards, cocking its shield arm back and readying itself to bash the outrider knight with the edge of the metal shield. Throwing its whole body forth, Vort slammed into the dragon slayer armor at the same time the golem smashed the shield into the servant. The two engaged in a shoving match with neither proving the stronger of the two. We've encountered Vort. Ritska alerted his servants through the mental link. The director's servant and the berserker from Rome are engaging him. Has anyone seen the weird creature Solaire spoke of yet? I've got nothing up here. Arash replied, Although I can see Solaire and our hunter friend Fig Thing through the eastern side, they went on ahead of Verndari and Cecilia. And how is Cecilia doing? Came Ash's curious voice. A subtle edge of concern was present which elicited a laugh of amusement from the archer. She's doing fine. That shadow of you is making short work of the small fry. Although I notice he's just using a regular old claymore. Must be a limit to how accurate she can make it. Well, as long as she's fine. All right then. Ritska called back to them, then turned to the others. Haven't seen any signs of the other servant yet, Director. Olga bit her thumb but then nodded her head. The berserkers will be able to deal with the enemy servant, although have Archer provide support if he can. In the meantime, we shall continue to push through to the center of the city and see if we can discover what Archer saw. Heavy footfalls alerted them to movement behind them. The group looked over their shoulder to see a dozen of Gwyndalin's sentinels burst through the gate ruins and into the city, swiftly locking onto the accursed targets they could see before they charged forwards. Their movements were slow and painfully choreographed. Against even the most basic servant, they would be little more than a nuisance. However, they had power and numbers on their side which more than made up for their obvious weakness. Aldrich Pav. Their attack on the city is in full swing. The caster servant reported, the number of servants they have at their disposal is far greater than imagined and can be properly dealt with. I have even sensed a divine spirit among them. Divine spirit. Aldrich rumbled with interest, a crooked smile coming onto his face. The Lord is attacking. How curious, have you identified them? Not as of yet. However, they seem to spawn armored guards through some method of conjuration. Ah, Gwendolyn then. Aldrich let out a pleased chuckle. I should not be surprised. How long can you hold out? Not long. They have already breached the walls and have begun advancing towards my location. Shall I withdraw? Have you completed the preparations yet? No. Then you are to remain. Summon your dear pet. That should provide some method of dealing with the servants. Ensure that your preparations are completed before you pass. Yes, the caster replied after a brief hesitation. You seem to be pleased. Lev noted with a bored expression. Something interesting happened. Well, I have just learned that an old friend I had for dinner is present in this singularity. Crooked teeth split into a pleased smile. Lev's face contorted in disgust as he watched the saint. However, the master of Chaldea and his allies are going to take the city, however my goal remains unhindered. Lev rolled his eyes in annoyance at the bluster. You already stand at a disadvantage due to the lack of servants at your command. They are not to be concerned with. The saint dismissed with a wave of his hand and an uncaring tone. The Duke will fulfill his objective, considering what he owes me. Besides, Lancer is already approaching them as we speak. Rather petty commitment that it is. Lev replied with a sigh as he flicked dirt out from underneath his fingernails, but I make no further comments about it. So long as you succeed and Chaldea is ruined, that is fine. There was a brief pause before he let out a low chuckle, although to think that little Olga Marie managed to make it this far. I'm almost proud of her growth. If it wasn't almost pathetically too late. Duke Seldora Pav. The Duke cut off the transmission with a small frown on his face, turning his head to gaze further down the street. The sounds of battle were drawing closer to him by the moment. He knew that the servants would be upon him soon. The man sighed. He had already fulfilled his wish and was merely carrying out his debt towards the one who had allowed him to. That, and he himself had been curious as to what spiders bathed in the deep would look like. It was an almost childish fascination he had wanted to see. One he knew he wouldn't be able to. He looked back down at the ritual. They were beginning to set up the connection with the ley line when Chaldea had attacked. And he wouldn't be able to. He cut himself off from whatever thought he had and widened his eyes in alarm, throwing his body forwards into a roll. It was barely fast enough as he felt something nick at the back of his neck and the rushing of wind caught his ears as something passed through the air where his head had been previously. I had thought you'd have been easier to slay. An almost bored voice came to his ears. Getting up from his haphazard dodge, he spun around to face his would-be killer. The man, if he could ever have been called that, was lanky. His skin appeared wooden with roots growing over his face, clad in ceremonial white robes which reminded him of a traditional cleric. His right arm was extended out to the side where he had obviously slashed at the Duke's head, in that hand he held a long steel sword. The Duke narrowed his eyes as he pat down his coat. I had thought an assassin would have been harder to detect. Do not think too highly of your skills. The wooden creature replied, I am, in fact, a caster. Although I will not deny that the class of assassin is open to me. Seldora scowled, his hand going to his hip and unsheathing his estoc. The enemy caster watched him with barely any reaction before he let out a scoff. You must be joking. The tone was bordering amusement. You're going to challenge me to a duel. Seldora gave him a placid smile. Of course not. His other hand quickly whipped out his staff before he slammed it into the ground, letting out a brief burst of light before the floor began to rumble. The caster watched this with mild interest as the Duke's spider familiars began to emerge from the ground, swiftly turning to face him and hissing. I would stand no chance against you in combat. Seldora went on with a shrug, however, I need only delay you until the time is right. The caster let out an amused chuckle in response to this, delay me. You are barely worth my attention. He relaxed his shoulders, which is why you shall to receive it. Seldora blinked in surprise. Wah! He stumbled forwards, his sentence cut off as a horrific pain flared through his back. He released a choked gasp as he stumbled, his right hand dropping the estoc and quickly clasping his burning shoulder on his opposite side. He cast a glance over his back to see a woman wearing dark robes and a pointed hat lower her glowing catalyst. You dare! Seldora swung his own catalyst towards her, the top glowing as it let loose a scattering blast of blue projectiles towards her. The spiders jumped at the first caster. With barely any effort on his part, he cut through them with ease as Seldora rushed the female caster. Beatrice jumped off the building as the sorceries impacted the location where she had been standing moments ago, turning to face the enemy caster. The man dressed in mismatching robe, the right half is a pale green color while the left was a darker tone of green. Raising her catalyst, she sent another soul arrow towards him. The man scowled and rolled away before waving his catalyst above his head. Several glowing orbs formed above his head as he continued to run, avoiding her blasts against him. The soul arrows shot forth towards Beatrice. The witch narrowed her eyes, she smirked. Swinging her catalyst upwards, light shot forth from the wooden staff and soon condensed into a small blade. The glowing weapon slashed through the minor sorceries with ease. Seldora slid to a halt and openly growled at Beatrice. The witch merely twirled her staff before resting it on the ground, a smug look coming onto her face. For another practitioner of sorcery, you aren't as good as I was expecting. Beatrice joked. Seldora's face scrunched up and went bright red with rage before he let out a howl of anger. Another flash of light emerged when he slammed his staff into the ground. Beatrice's smile disappeared and her face became more pensive as more spiders began to emerge, facing towards her. Seldora smirked at her. Any more remarks, witch? Beatrice remained silent for a few moments before she allowed herself a small smile. I suppose I'm not bad for a distraction. Seldora barely registered the words she said before he felt a presence seemingly manifest itself next to him. Not a moment later, the man turned around just in time to see one of the giant armored illusions looming over him. He widened his eyes in alarm and attempted to scramble away. He was, however, far too slow as the knight swung its shield at him. The viscous armored backhand sent him careening through the air and smashing through the side of a nearby house. Sullivan pointed his catalyst sword at another target. The blade glowed a deep purple before it shot off a beam of energy towards the spider, the creature being vaporized in the blast. Turning his head, he managed to catch a glimpse of Seldora's small flight and subsequent crash as the sentinel dissipated. Thee should have slain him. Gwyndolin's voice echoed out around the caster. T would have been simpler. It is beneath me. Sullivan replied casually as he continued to cut down the familiars, and the heretic, which has the situation under control. Beatrice shot forth another dozen soul arrows, the blue orbs lancing through the air before they cut through their targets. The spiders, having little in the way of magic resistance, were easily slain as she made her way towards the house the Duke had been flung into. Peering her head in through the hole, she smirked as she saw the man lying on his back coughing heavily from the impact. Raising her catalyst up, she made to fire off a soul spear before a rumbling threw her off balance. Her expression turned anxious as her eyes darted in all directions. The situation was made worse when she heard the Duke's quiet chuckle from the ground. "What is that?" Beatrice demanded, threateningly pointing her catalyst at the man. The Duke regarded her with a blank stare before his expression turned smug. "My beloved," he answered with a grin. Solaire grabbed Lucien's shoulder to steady the man so he didn't fall over. The hunter sent him a small nod in return before he turned his expression back to the surrounding city. The rumbling had gotten worse in the last few seconds. "In the hell is this?" The hunter scowled, pulling out his pistol and gunning down another spider before he dropped the weapon into a murky black puddle and allowed it to fade away. Solaire narrowed his eyes. I am not sure." Pausing, he paid closer attention to the rumbling, which was now beginning to sound like a thumping sound, although the frequency between strikes was far too many to be considered footsteps. The smelter demon's clawed hand latched onto the handle of Vort's mace, stopping the swing dead. The berserker made to growl at the interference before the dragon slayer armor slammed its shield into the outrider knight's chin. Vort's head snapped up, the pointed metal chin of his helm having been dented inwards by the force of the strike. Following the attack through, the smelter demon lashed out, punching Vort in the face with the hilt of its greatsword. The berserker stumbled back with a grunt of pain. The smelter demon made to advance. There was a brief silence. Then a beam of pure white heat shot out of the ground. The smelter demon released a roar as the beam lanced its way up the side of its armor, leaving a melted mark along its body as it burned upwards. The berserker was sent staggering away. The dragon slayer armor raised its own shield to block the strike, only for the force behind the beam to impact the shield and knock the berserker off their feet and onto their back. Crap! Ritska cursed, tackling the director to the ground as the beam continued to shoot off in all directions, narrowly sailing over their heads. Mash planted her shield down in front of the pair. The beam caught the side of the cross shield and causing the girl to let out a grunt and dig her heels into the ground to keep herself upright. "Good gods!" Nero cried out in alarm, throwing herself down alongside the masters for cover. The beam soon changed its angle and cut along the ground before shooting off into the air and cutting itself off. "What the?" Ritska slowly got off the director, completely ignoring her gobsmacked expression. "What the hell was that?" "What?" Olga expression turned furious. "What were you thinking, you brute? Tackling my like that? Have some tact." Ritska turned to her, then blinked in realization. Sorry. Just the beam came up and well, kind of panicked there." "Well, thank you." She acknowledged with a small nod, then turned her expression back towards the direction the beam had come from. There was a heavy thump coming from the center of the city. The spiders and Romans paused as one, all staring off in the direction of the noise. "Arash, what is it?" Ritska nervously called out through the link. The archer himself was glaring towards the center of the town. Goff was alongside him and staring down there. "Fujimaru. Director." Romani's panicked voice came through the communicator. "You've got huge reading approaching you. Its magical energy is way beyond a normal servant." "What?" Olga's voice turned panicked. "What do you?" The central plaza of the city exploded outwards. Dirt and cobblestone was hurled in a sudden burst as something pushed its way out from underneath the ground. Arash and Goff were able to get a good look at what it was before anyone else. Their view from the top of the nearby mountainside was far enough away that they could just about make out what had caused the explosion. "I think you're gonna need your bow again." Arash spoke first, a slight hint of worry in his voice. Goff wordlessly nodded his head, drawing back his bow. "Contact thy lord." Tell them to make haste away from the plaza. On it. Urash acknowledged, soon carrying out the command, Urash to all servants. I'd recommend getting the heck out of there. Goff is about to start letting loose some arrows on the, target. What target? Ritska cried back. What the heck was that? Are you over your fear of spiders yet? Quote. Never mind then. Beatrice backed away from the cloud. She and the pontiff had been the closest to the emergence. The caster had already jumped away and onto a nearby building. Beatrice wasn't quite as agile as he was, so she settled for making a hasty retreat further down the street. Come, my dear. The enemy caster cried out with joy, marching towards the cloud with his arms wide. My beauty. My beloved. Beatrice managed to catch glowing red orbs through the clouds as they soon focused in on her, feeling her whole body suddenly overcome with a sudden case of anxiety from the pressure exuded by the thing's gaze. My Freya. An ear-piercing scream cut through the air, the force of which dissipated the clouds in an instant, leaving behind the being responsible for them in the first place. Quote. Oh fuck. Beatrice cursed, spinning on her heel and sprinting away as fast as her legs could allow her. The sheer scale of the beast was enough for her to forego any form of nervousness as she virtually disappeared into the wind, making full use of her D-rank agility. Sullivan watched her sprint away before slowly turning his head back to the now-named Freya. The giant spider, who seemed to possess two heads with one located at the front of the body and one located at the back, the armored skin looked to be made of deep gray stone with traces of moss covering it. The size of the beast was easily dwarfing all other spiders, being larger than the buildings surrounding them. These should have killed the fool. Gwyndolin's voice called out. Sullivan withheld a curse, instead opting to take a similar approach to his female counterpart. In that he quickly fled the scene at a much greater pace than her. Okay. Ritska was facing Olga, and Nero while Mash stood in front of them, so, according to Archer, it's a big spider. A big spider that can shoot laser beams, if the display a moment ago was any indication. Senpai, are you alright? Mash called back to him with a noticeable concern. Me. I'm great, I'm just not going to turn around if that's alright with all of you. He nodded, still not facing the direction the spider was in. Anyway, Urash said that Goff is going to be firing on it any second. There was a distant clap of thunder and a whistling sound akin to missile before a blur slammed into the side of Fija. The spider let out a growl of annoyance, slowly turning its head in the direction of the attack. The side that had been struck carrying only a small crack. Oh dear, Goff rumbled. Dragon scales, he muttered, preparing another arrow. It has dragon scales. That bad? Urash asked, pulling back his own bow. We need miracles. I can damage it if I can. Freya's mandibles parted. The back of her throat began to glow a bright white color as energy began to coalesce around her mouth. The spider took in a sharp intake of breath before the beam shot outwards, instantly crossing the distance between Freya and Goff. The giant widened his eyes behind his helm, throwing his body to the side moments before the beam had a chance to hit him. Freya kept up the assault, aiming her mouth downwards and dragging the beam of light across the mountain towards the giant, cutting through trees and stone as she came closer and closer to her target. Goff let out a brief noise of surprise before throwing himself into a roll. The giant flung themselves down the mountain side, letting out an occasional grunt as he fell. Urash let out a similar noise of surprise as he sprinted away as well. Seeing her targets flee, Freya aimed her beam further up, slicing through the upper parts of the mountain side and causing rocks to become displaced. Cutting off her beam, there was a deep rumble which soon emanated from the mountain. The rumble soon grew into a roar as a chunk of the mountain gave way. Rock and hillside churned as they fell, causing an avalanche of debris to rain down. Goff lifted his head from the roll and turned around just in time to take in the scenery, before the scenery soon submerged him underneath it. Urash was sprinting ahead of the avalanche, briefly catching a glimpse of the giant being buried by it and allowing a scowl to come to his face before he continued on. While he would like nothing better than to help his fellow archer, there was very little he could do while also trying to outrun landslide of rocks. Ritska, Olga, Mash and Nero watched the landslide with expressions of horror, their heads slowly turning back towards the center of the town. The Romans were already backing away from the direction of Freya. The giant spider slowly turned its head to face their direction. Ritska felt himself freeze up as the largest arachnid, even larger than Quelaag, he had ever seen fixed its gaze upon him and the other servants. Something slid into his peripheral vision, causing him to let out a girlish scream and spin around to face it. Beatrice regarded him blankly for a few moments before she turned her head back towards Freya. I think she's the noble phantasm of the caster. She informed them. I wasn't able to kill him, sorry. Worry about it later. Ritska squeaked. It took out Arash and Goff, so we need to pull back a bit. You've got more trouble. Romani's voice called, and Ritska had never hated the man more than he did right now after that particular sentence. There's another servant signature coming in, they're heading right towards you. Ritska, Mash, Olga and Nero turned their heads to the side. There was a cloud of dust descending along the opposite side of the valley, counter to the direction that Arash and Goff had been. Ritska had no doubt that was the new servant. Can you get any readings on it? They have a pretty average-looking Saint graph if I'm honest. He replied, slightly relaxed, I'd say 4 stars. Ritska gave an incredulous blink. Out of what? Quote. 5. Roman. Sorry. I was trying to make you feel better and take your mind off the giant spider. Not helping. A ball of fire slammed into the side of Freya. The spider took no damage save regard it as an annoyance. Ash was perched atop a building and hurriedly leapt away as the spider slammed a leg into the house, obliterating it and sending the saber flying through the air at an awkward angle. The ground underneath the middle of Freya soon lit up, a pillar shooting upwards and causing the summon to let out a hiss as it swung around to see Quelaag leaping across buildings with a scowl on her face, already preparing another priomancy. Leave the spider to myself and Quelaag. Ash's voice came through the link. We'll deal with it. I can sense another servant approaching you. How goes the battle with Vort? Ritska turned his head just in time to see Vort slam into the burning berserker's chest, tackling the servant through a house as Olga swiftly picked up its shield and followed after through the debris. The sounds of metal clashing against metal soon followed. It's going, was all he said on the topic, turning his head back towards the cloud of dust. Gareth, Sif. We've got another servant incoming. Can you get over here, please? On our way, master. Came Gareth's hurried reply. Ritska allowed himself a brief sigh of relief. Gareth and Sif are on their way. Ritska announced to the odd group that he had, but we don't really have a way of contacting anyone else right now. Looking away, Arash. Are you and Goff alright? I'm fine. Goff got caught in the landslide, so we're going to have to wait for him to dig himself out. I'd try and help him, but I don't know what I could do that he couldn't do better in this situation. Alright, try and find another place to shoot from. We're going to need those spiders cleared out so we can deal with the big one, and if you can, try and help us with the incoming servant. Do what I can, be ready in a few moments. Arash says that Goff got caught in the landslide, and he's having to reposition. Ritska informed them, so, we're basically on our own for the time being against the servant while the others deal with everything else in the town. The servant's nearly on top of you. Romani called out again. It looks like a Lancer class from these readings. The dust cloud had steadily gotten closer to the point where the group could now make out the faint outline of a figure charging towards them. The shining reflection gave the detail of armor, however that was all they could manage from the servant thus far. Stay behind me, Senpai. Mash exclaimed, rushing to the front and slamming her shield into the ground, pulling out her straight sword and holding it tightly in her hands. Beatrice stood next to her, although looked far more tense. Remain out of danger, Pale Rose. Nero proclaimed, strutting forwards and leveling her sword towards the cloud, the mysterious flames still clinging to her blade as she glared towards it. Where is Lancer and Saber? Olga nervously asked. Ritska bit his lip, eyes darting to the side and further into the city, the outer wall now being non-existent due to the spider's laser beam decimating it, providing them with a clear view of the carnage. Roman soldiers frantically involved in desperate struggles against the spiders while there were flashes of light coming from the direction of Freya, the giant spider still involved in the scuffle with Ash and Quelaag. They'll be here soon. Hopefully. He neglected to mention the last part as he faced the direction of the cloud, the servant showing no indication of slowing down in the least. The armored servant locked onto Mash and seemingly picked up their pace considerably. Ritska and Olga backed away. Beatrice held up her staff and let loose a small barrage of spells. The lancer barely paid them any mind as they sped towards his body, abruptly rolling forwards causing most to pass over his head before returning to his feet and continuing his sprint towards them. Mash prepared herself for the collision as the servant adjusted himself, looking like he was going for a shoulder barge. For a brief moment, Ritska thought that Romani had been wrong and it was another berserker servant. Then the servant slid to a halt, spinning on their heel as their left hand shot upwards, clasping the underside of the rightmost section of the cross shield. Mash let out a brief noise of surprise as the lancer servant literally threw her into the air and away from them. Continuing on from his preemptive strike, he turned on Beatrice, the caster shooting a soul spear directly into his chest. There was a glancing blow as he adjusted his body to the side, the spear still impacted him and leaving a burn march across his upper pectoral armor piece. The problem was that he didn't even flinch. Slipping his other hand onto his weapon, a large halberd, he dragged the base of it along the ground before thrusting the butt of the weapon upward in an uppercut. The handle caught Beatrice in the chest, the caster let loose a bloodied cough as she was violently launched into the air. Turning his body, the lancer thrust the halberd forwards like a spear, directly into the flat end of Astis Estis. Nero grit her teeth as she blocked the strike. The lancer, remaining silent the whole time, merely pulled the halberd back before performing a roundhouse kick. Nero widened her eyes in alarm and threw her body back, the armored heel passing a scant few centimeters in front of her eyes. The moment his heel came back down to earth, Lancer rotated his body a full 90 degrees before thrusting himself forwards into a shoulder barge. The flat of her blade was raised again and absorbed most of the impact, however the force was still enough to blast her away. The entire opening engagement had lasted barely 10 seconds. Lancer swung the halberd towards the masters, the weapon slammed into Mash's shield with a weighty clang. Stopping dead in its tracks, Mash grit her teeth due to the force of the blow. It was certainly powerful, although she remembered he berserker from Fuyuki and how he was still stronger. They now got a good look at the lancer. Ritska widened his eyes. This form was exactly the same as the person he had seen in his dreams earlier. Their armor and weapon were identical, although they looked much shorter than he had remembered them being. Although they were still nearly 2 meters tall, so they were far above his own height, and unlike Sullivan, this servant had obvious bulk in his build. Clad head to toe in steel, decorated armor, he stared them down. He was marginally similar to Vrindari in that there was a face carved onto his helm. The empty expression stared at the shield, the head tilted slightly in mild curiosity, as if he hadn't been expecting it before the head straightened out again. A howl from his right caused him to snap his head to the side, seconds before he raised his arms in front of him to block a strike from Gareth as she thrust her lance into him, the blow knocking the lancer away and sending him skidding backwards in an explosion of blue light. Sliding to a halt, he lowered his arms and faced the new opponents. Sif let out a growl with Gareth cocked her lance back and raised her shield. You alright, master? Mash. Fine. Ritska let out a breath of relief at seeing the duo. Thanks for coming so soon. Of course. Gareth beamed, turning her attention back to the lancer. Has he introduced himself yet? No. What? Gareth blinked, looking appalled before facing the lancer again. No introduction. Why not? Where's your pride as a? She squinted, looking at his armor up and down. A knight. Warrior. Why should I have pride? The voice called back, cold and emotionless. I kill. That is all that is required of me. To obey commands, to kill when told. He twirled his halberd, facing the group, that is all. Gareth frowned. That doesn't sound fulfilling. What about a sense of achievement? I complete my purpose. That is all that is required of me. He replied in the same empty tone of voice. Further talk is pointless, prepare yourself. And those moves. That weapon. Yes. The one. The only. Champion Gundyr. You know what this means. Stat time. Oh, yeah. Seldora is here as well, isn't he? Gundyr. Servant. Lancer. Strength. B++. Endurance. A, B. Agility. B+. Mana. D. Luck. E. Noble Phantasm. A. Vindex. B. Weapon is unbreakable, regardless of stress or attack suffered. Champion's Wrath. A. Unexpected resistance has been met, further strength required. Boosts strength to B++. Class skills. Magic resistance. C. Personal skills. Instinct. B. Eternal arms mastery. C. Will still fight with great skill, regardless of mental hindrance. Hand to hand. B. Even when void of his weapon, he remains a fearsome opponent with his extensive combat techniques. Prisoner's Chain. B. Boosts strength and agility to B+ while endurance is lowered to B. Battle continuation. B. Summoning. Lancer. Gundyr. Use me as you see fit. Dialogue 1. Awaiting your instructions. Dialogue 2. Is there need of me? Dialogue 3. You are my master. I am a tool, I have no opinion. Dialogue 4. If you have cu Chilane altar. A king who is king because he can kill. He stands atop all warriors. It makes sense. I see no issue. I am a warrior because I kill. I kill because I am a warrior. That is it. Dialogue 5. If you have fire keeper. A fire keeper. I was to have one. I failed. Dialogue 6. If you have ashen one. I judged his skill. He killed me. That was that. Dialogue 7. If you have nightingale. She thinks me ill. I do not know what illness is. I merely serve my purpose, that is all. Dialogue 8. If you have any of the cu Chilane. To battle and find enjoyment in it. I do not understand. Dialogue 9. If you have Enkidu. It is a weapon. They have a will. I do not understand. Dialogue 10. If you have Altera. She destroys because that is her role. It makes sense. No. There is more. I do not understand. Dialogue 11. If you have Emiya altar. I kill because I am told. He kills because he is told. I do not see a difference. Dialogue 12. If you have Emiya. He said I am a living counter guardian. I do not know what that is. I think he does not like me, or he pities me. I do not understand. Dialogue 13. If you have Atalanta. She talks of joys of childhood. I do not know. I remember long ago. I remember preparations for my role. The chain around me. I can't. I do not understand what she sees in children. I do not understand. What is childhood? Dialogue 14. If you have Canis. The Lancer. She tries to exhibit emotions from me. I don't understand. I do not understand anger. She became frustrated and called me soulless. I do not. Did I fail somehow? Dialogue 15. If you have Mordred. She was created for a role. She succeed but she is sad. Why? I do not understand why she is sad. Is it because she expired after? I do not know. Dialogue 16. If you have Avenger servants. I do not understand hatred. So I do not understand why they are controlled by it. Is hatred useful? Likes. I have no joys. Hates. I have no hates. Wish for the Holy Grail. I have no wish. Bond level 1. I am useful. That is acceptable. Blonde level 2. Your concern is unneeded. I am within optimal parameters. Blonde level 3. Why do you question beyond my functions? Is there some issue? Bond level 4. You continue to question my abilities. I have no issues with my mind. I am within optimal parameters to complete your orders. Bond level 5. I obey, because that is all I am. I am, because I obey. I do not understand anything else. This feeling when you speak with me. It is pain, but it is not. It is similar when I look back on a failed objective, but I have obeyed all my orders. Why do I feel this pain when I look back on my life? Birthday. I see. During an event. Am I to be commanded to the front? First ascension. I am stronger. Second ascension. This is an improvement to my body. Third ascension. I can better fulfill your orders now. Fourth ascension. I am at my optimal level of abilities. Command me as you would. Duke Seldora. Servant. Caster. Strength. E. Endurance. E. Agility. D. Mana. B. Luck. C. Noble Phantasm. A+. Duke's Dear Freya. A+. Anti-army. Max target. 100. Max range. 0 to 90. Class skills. Item construction. D. Territory creation. C. Personal skills. Appreciation for spiders. A. Understanding of arachnids, can command them and form links to act as pseudo familiars. Brightstone familiars. B. The spiders of Brightson, a mine named after himself, they can be summoned to act as his warriors. Sorcery. C. Summoning. I am Seldora, Duke of Brightson Cove. Where might I set up my study? Dialogue 1. Have you ever paid close attention to spiders before? Such beautiful creatures they are. Dialogue 2. My studies. They progress fine. A fear of spiders, you say? What a ludicrous notion. Dialogue 3. Master and servant. You are my summoner. I would say assistant researcher. Dialogue 4. If you have Quetzalcoatl. The Lord has made mention that she has a strong dislike for my precious familiars. I will keep my distance. Dialogue 5. If you have divine spirits. Lords about. My word. I have never thought to have seen so many. Dialogue 6. If you have Quelaag. She is beautiful, isn't she? That armored carapace, that burning maw, those segmented legs. Dialogue 7. If you have Avisbron. I suppose we both have a passion of ours. He wishes to recreate his Adam. I wish to birth my beloved Freya again. I wasn't able to see her in life. Dialogue 8. If you have King Vendrick. I am keeping my distance from the king right now. Because he would likely have my head if I showed myself before him. Dialogue 9. If you have servants from Dangalik. A sense of home. Best I avoid them. They would consider my work to be, how shall we say, morally bankrupt. Dialogue 10. If you have bearer of the curse. Vile harlot slew my beloved Freya. If I have the opportunity to get even, I will, but don't tell her I said that. She could probably break me over her knee. Dialogue 10. If you have Patches. There's something strange about him. I told him of my obsession with spiders. He merely laughed at me. But it wasn't malicious, it is as if he was aware of something I didn't know. Or he was laughing that he experienced something I haven't. Rather odd. Likes. I have a passion for spiders. No. That would not be true, I have an obsession with them, because they really are so very interesting. Hates. I have a strong dislike for those who hate spiders, no, who actively kill them in front of me. It is something I dislike. Wish for the Holy Grail. Well, I would prefer my own research achieve my goal. Bond level 1. I suppose you aren't terrible to be around at the moment, Master. Blonde level 2. My research. Scared of spiders, you say? You are. A travesty. We must right this wrong. Blonde level 3. I have come up with several solutions to your fear, although it will take time to cultivate the hive. Bond level 4. You don't mind spiders but you can't say you love them. I suppose that it is good enough for now. Bond level 5. Assistant, there you are. Come, I have a fresh specimen I wish to show you. Birthday. A birthday. I suppose I should grant you blessings then. During an event. What a strange noise. First ascension. Yes, I have gotten stronger. Second ascension. This power, it will serve me well. Third Ascension. Soon, my dear Freya, soon. Fourth Ascension. I am closer to my goal than I ever dreamed possible. This is thanks to your efforts, I hope you will see the end result. Freya is going to be most beautiful. Welcome to Fanfic Audiobook, your go-to place for immersive audiobooks. If you enjoy the content, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories. Chapter 40. Itsy Bitsy Spider. Servant's Pav. Ash leapt through the air, the giant sharpened spear of a leg slammed down into the ground where he had been moments ago. Spinning around, he swung his greatsword into the offending limb. The blade struck the armored carapace with a dull clang, leaving no evidence of any damage. Ash was momentarily dumbfounded before the leg swung out towards him, catching him in the shoulder as he attempted to dodge and sending his body helicoptering through the air before crashing through the roof of a nearby house. Quelaag barely paid any attention to her ally being batted away like trash as she kept her gaze firmly locked onto the large spider, the giant arachnid now spinning around to face her, the glowing red eyes locked onto her before it let out a hiss and charged forwards. The spider bulldozed its way through the entire housing section, sending debris flying in all directions as it chased down the Chaos Witch. Quelaag spun around and threw an orb of fire towards the spider's head. She narrowed her eyes when she noticed that the spider slid to a halt and tilted its body to the side so the flames avoided its face. She cracked a smile. Weakness is the head. She cried out, "Go for the head." Understood. A gruff voice called out behind her. She caught a glimpse of the form of the new servant, some hunter or something, leap through the air and throw out a whip, lashing it around the highest joint of the spider's leg and swinging himself forwards. He released himself at the peak height and soared into the air, his left hand manifesting a large dark metal tube before he took aim towards the spider's head. The end of the tube exploded and sent forth a large steel ball as a projectile. Freya let out a pained roar as the ball slammed into the side of its head, ripping off several of its smaller mandibles on the right side of its face. The recoil of the cannon blasted the hunter back through the air, although the man maintained a calm pose as he landed onto the street and rolled back to his feet, spinning around to see Freya letting loose a pained scream before it fixed its eyes on him with murderous intent. Lucian regarded the spider blankly before he span on his heel and sprinted into a nearby alleyway. The white beam followed suit, the extreme heat produced cut through the entire neighborhood as he sliced through the air. Lucian ducked low, throwing his body down flat as the beam passed overhead. The building next to him exploded outwards in a shower of burning debris, covering his body. Vrindari lowered his shield, poking his head out from the side, his face set in a disturbed expression as he stared at the damage in front of him. Having not been entirely aware of the events of the last few moments, from his perspective all he had heard were heavy rumbles, the sound of an explosion and then a beam of magic started cutting through buildings. He was thankful that his barrier had held up, protecting the people behind him. What in the bloody pit was that? The man exclaimed in shock, looking behind himself to the Romans behind him. How injured are you all? We're all fine, sir. A voice called out from behind him. One of the soldiers with an expression of fear mixed with relief nodded to him. Thank you for the protection, sir. We've still got a town to clear. Vrindari grunted, turning back around. I shall assume the others are seeing to whatever it was that caused that last attack. Stay behind me in case of any further sorceries. Yes, sir. The armored man continued to stomp forward, then raised his shield again as a shadow passed in front of him, only to relax slightly when he caught sight of what it was. Fire Keeper Cecilia. He nodded in greeting to her. The woman being carried bridal style by the phantom copy of Ash turned her head to look towards him. Sir Vrindari. It pleases me to see thou art safe. What's going on out there? All I can tell is that my liege is engaged in a servant and that some form of situation has occurred in the center of the town. 'Tis a monster of some kind. Cecilia explained, truly a frightening thing, a large spider who spews forth magic. Milord, the good hunter and Lady Quelaag are engaged with it. Vrindari frowned behind his helm, what of the witch Beatrice and the betrayer Sullivan? To my knowledge, they engaged the summoner before the beast arrived. To where they are now, I cannot answer. Unfortunate, but not detrimental. Verndari replied, I will continue with the original objective and clear out the remaining spiders from this location, and yourself. Sir Solaire bid me to avoid direct confrontation with the beast. As well he should, not to insult your current efforts, but you would be a liability on the front lines. The Shielder stated, travel with me as I clear through the town, your phantom and miracles would be better served that way. As thou wishes. Cecilia nodded, I know my lord would be more comforted in that anyway. Most likely. He waved his men to follow him. Come, I am aware that you have some small number of healing miracles, I would ask you put those to use should we become injured. Of course. Rock exploded outwards as Goff pushed himself out from underneath the mound of hillside he had been buried under. Cracking his neck, the giant looked around at his location. Well, that was a new one, I suppose. He grumbled to himself, placing his hands on the ground and pushing himself back up onto his feet, rising back to his full height and looking around. Now. Where is my bow? The giant frowned behind his helmet as he couldn't immediately spot it near him. He knew he had lost his grip on it when the hill fell on them, but he didn't think it could have gotten that far. Another explosion sounded off in the distance. Goff turned his head to stare down at the city, making out the large spider still wreaking havoc on the location. He squinted his eyes. The other servants were too close to it for him to reliably hit the spider and do no damage to them, not to mention the problem of its body being composed of dragon scales. He could get through them eventually, but it was always easier to have someone with lightning miracles on hand. He willed his bow away. It would take some time for it to return to him, thus he made up his mind. He was still a giant, first and foremost. Which meant he had the benefit of ridiculous strength on his side. Thus, anyone who had been paying attention at the time would have been treated to the very odd, and very intimidating, sight of a giant sprinting full pelt down the side of a mountain as he raced towards the spider. A ringing bell echoed out. Freya looked to the source only to take a bolt of lightning to the eye, reeling back with a hiss and stomping her legs on the ground where the sunlight bolt had come from. Solaire jumped off the roof he had been on before the giant spider smashed its limb into it, rolling to a halt and spinning around, only to get tackled by a smaller spider. The saber servant grunted as it continued to bash and claw at him with its mandibles. Pulling out his straight sword, Solaire used his free hand to grip the spider just underneath the fangs and hoist it up so it could not bite him before he thrust downwards and through its head. Quickly pulling the sword away and swinging it behind him, cutting off the limb of another spider which had tried to sneak up on him. Before he could finish it, a beam of purple light slammed into the spider, blasting through its body and sending the remains shooting off in several directions. Solaire blinked behind his helm, lowering his sword and staring into the direction the projectile had come from. Sullivan lowered his glowing blade and looked down at the knight. Do not read too deeply into this. It is simply better to have more aid in situations like these. I concur. Solaire nodded his head, spinning around and running off and back towards Freya. Sullivan watched him depart before his head trailed over to the direction of the hole where the spider had emerged. He would have scowled if he had a face. The caster who had summoned the beast had fled into that hole and was, at this moment, the only true lead they had on Aldrich. However, they first had to deal with whatever manner of creature this thing was. He could feel the sheer power it held, not to mention the beam of pure magic it had used to shoot them with. It was, by all accounts, an abomination. It also prickled his curiosity, because what manner of spider possessed the scales of an everlasting dragon? Not that he could do much to satisfy it right now. Lucian threw the rubble off his body, dusting away the soot from his clothes before looking back over to the spider with a scowl. Something landed next to him with a thud. He turned his head to see another of the knights staring at him. If he recalled correctly, you're that Ash, right? Yes. Ash nodded back, turning his head to look at Freya as she continued to try and stamp down on Quelaag and Solaire. The head is the weakness, but it does well in protecting it. Then there's whatever that breath attack it has is. Lucian nodded his head in affirmation. Need to try and get its attention away. Think it needs both heads to live. I do not know. Ash replied, perhaps one is merely a spare. Quote. Sounds about right. Lucian shrugged his shoulders, leaning down to pull his saw blade out of the rubble and shake the dust away before flicking it out. Don't know about its skin. Dragon scales. Ash supplied, although they are stronger than the last dragon I fought. Except around the head. Quote. Think we could go for the joints. Perhaps. Ash nodded his head, but it's whether we could remain on the legs long enough to hamper its movement before it shook us off. Lucian shrugged his shoulders, let me worry about that. If nothing else, we'll keep it distracted so you can go for the heads. Very well. Ash nodded in response, flicking his sword so it became coated in black fire. I wish you luck then. You too. The pair shot off in different directions. Ash made a run straight for the head of Freya while Lucian made a dash for the leg. Master Group Pav. Mash skated backwards as the sole of Gundar's armored foot slammed into the shield. The Lancer wasted little time in transitioning the movement as he turned around to face Nero. The Emperor slashed towards his torso. Gundyr blocked the burning sword with the pole of his halberd, parrying the blow away before he stabbed the axe blade into the ground. He swung his body forwards in the direction of Nero, slamming his fist into her gut with enough force to blast her away like a cannon. In the same movement, he ripped his halberd from the ground with a portion of the dirt still embedded on the end of the axe head. Spinning around, he swung the halberd like a club, sending the lump of ground shooting off towards the surrounding servants like a wild buckshot. Mashed dove in front of the masters as the pseudo-projectiles crashed into her shield. Raising his leg, he stomped into the ground, releasing a blast wave which threw up a cloud of dust, obscuring his form as Sif and Gareth rushed towards him. Sif ran towards the cloud, shifting the greatsword in his mouth as he made to slash at the cloud of dust. Gundar's fist rocketed outwards and slammed into the nose of the wolf. The animal recoiled violently with a whine of pain at the injury. The blow dissipated the cloud as Gareth rushed in from the opposite side, cocking back her jousting lance as she made for Gundar's back. The lancer spun around to face her while simultaneously swinging the butt of his halberd towards Sif. The weapon smacked the side of the wolf's head before he thrust it towards Gareth. Gareth ducked low, angling her shield so that the blade of the halberd was deflected away from her body and to the side as she thrust the lance into his chest. Gundyr held up his free arm in a blocking motion. The lance connected with his forearm before exploding in blue light. Gundyr stumbled backwards, his left arm recoiled away from the blow as several patches of burnt metal were flung away from his limb. Gundyr let out a grunt as he kicked out with his right leg. Gareth held up her shield. The blow slammed into her defense, rattling her body as the force knocked her into the air. However, the Lancer had no time to pressure his advantage as Sif pounced on him from behind. He tilted his head to the side just enough that the edge of the greatsword just barely scratched his armored cheek. He growled, rolling himself to the side and slamming his elbow into the side of Sif's body. The wolf let out a whine as it was flung away from him. Gundyr turned to pursue before a painful jolt of heat spread throughout his left leg. Kicking out with the limb, Nero ducked under the blow as she pulled her red blade away from the leg. Turning his head to face the Emperor, Gundyr let out a groan as he felt his leg weaken slightly, the large cut running just behind his knee hampering his movements somewhat. I was curious as to what manner of fiend would dare to strike as my Rome, but you are but a mere slave, are you not? Nero proclaimed with a frown, 'tis almost pitiful to behold. Gundyr offered no retort as he span his halberd in his hand, leveling the blade towards the Emperor and hunching his body forwards, ignoring the wound in his leg as he stared down at the smaller blonde girl. He shot forwards. Nero ducked back as his halberd swung through the air where her neck had been previously. An arrow of blue light slammed into his side. He barely reacted to it as he punched his free hand into the ground, ripping out a large section of the earth and throwing it towards Beatrice as he continued his charge of the Emperor. Nero ran backwards as Gundyr slammed the halberd into the ground near her feet, ripping it upwards in a shower of debris as he blasted through, clearing the distance between the two of them in a single step. His armored fist slammed into the flat of her blade as she raised it in a guard. The impact caused her to wince in pain as she was knocked away. Gundyr continued the charge as the Emperor hurtled through the air, reaching out towards her, only to stumble to the side when Gareth slammed her shield into him. "Not so fast!" she shouted out. Gundyr moved with the blow swinging his halberd towards her. Not fast enough before the side of Mash's shield struck the back of his elbow. His arm flinched as the halberd fell from his grip. Then he slammed his elbow into Mash's face. The girl let out a cry of pain as she stumbled backwards. Gundyr let out a roar. The darkened eye ports of his helmet now glowed bright red as he span towards Gareth, rearing his right fist back. The girl shot backwards as the arm slammed into the ground, the impact alone causing an explosion air. The shockwave blasted the entire group away from him. Gareth let out a gasp as she found herself in the air. Gundyr clasped his hand around her ankle, violently wrenching her back down towards him. She thrust the lance towards him. He batted away with his left hand as he released her leg, then lashed out with the hand that had gripped her ankle and latched onto her face. Her eyes widened in alarm as he slammed her into the ground, her body leaving an imprint with enough force to cause her vision to blur. Then he sprinted, dragging her body through the ground with enough force to leave a trail along the dirt. Within the span of a few seconds, he had dragged her around 100 meters before throwing her up into the air. Gareth coughed out blood when he reared back his left arm, then slammed it into her chest with his enhanced strength, which could have matched Gawain under the sun. She felt her ribs break from the impact as she shot away from him, crashing into the ground in an explosion of dirt. "Gareth!" Mash cried out in horror as she raced towards Lancer. Gundyr turned his head towards her, spinning his body and charging her down in a burst of speed, clearing the distance between the two of them in but a moment. Mash had just enough time to raise her shield before Gundyr's shin collided with her guard. The clang of metal echoed out loud enough to dull all other sounds in the general vicinity. A dozen arrows slammed into his side as he released a howl. Ritska blinked in surprise before he heard a voice call through his head, "I'm supporting you now, Master. I can try and keep him off balance." "Thank you, Arash." Ritska jubilantly replied back as he faced Olga. "That was Archer, he's going to support us against Lancer. How is your Berserker doing?" Vort vs. Smelter Demon in Dragon Slayer Armor POV. Mace struck shield with an almighty clang. The Dragon Slayer armor swung its shield arm up, deflecting the mace away from its body before it swung its own axe downwards. Vort let out a cry as the giant weapon buried itself in the Berserker's shoulder width. The scream of pain became intertwined with the sound of metal being ripped asunder as the axe tore through the armored plating before becoming stuck. Vort charged forwards, slamming itself into the Dragon Slayer armor's chest and balling it over, rolling around as the axe in its shoulder was wrenched free from its body. In a fit of rage-induced aggression, Vort repeatedly slammed the mace down into the head of the opposing Berserker. The Dragon Slayer armor let out a groan as one of the protruding wings along the side of its helm bent inwards as the metal began to scuff. The frozen Berserker did not get the chance to press its advantage as the Smelter Demon tackled it off, grappling with the Outrider Knight in a tangled mass of limbs as they engaged in a shoving match to prove who was superior. The wound Vort had suffered placed him at a considerable disadvantage in that regard. Something the Smelter Demon took full advantage of. The flaming Berserker let out a loud roar as it slammed its head into Vort's armored face. The Outrider Knight recoiled violently as the metal caved inwards from the blow. The Smelter Demon then gripped the wounded arm with both hands, and twisted. Metal shrieked as it was violently wrenched out of place. The Outrider Knight let out a wail of pain as the already wounded arm was crippled to such an extent that it was bent in two places, the torn metal making locked in place like a freakish jigsaw, ensuring the arm could not move. Attempting to launch some manner of counter-attack, Vort made an effort to swing their mace towards the Berserker's head. The gauntlet of the Dragon Slayer armor clenched around his wrist barely halfway to the target. The smelter demon raised its great sword pointed downwards, stabbing it through Vort's trapped wrist and pinning it to the ground. Vort thrashed like a dog, frantically batting away at the two with his broken arm as it attempted to free its nailed wrist. The Dragon Slayer armor gripped its axe with two hands, bringing it high above its head before it exploded with lightning, visibly glowing as it crackled, bolts shooting off and scorching along the ground. The smelter demon leapt away as it ripped its sword free of the Outrider Knight's wrist. Vort made an attempt to flee. Far too late, as the armor slammed the axe down on Vort's head in an explosion of lightning, blasting away the nearby houses, and cratering the ground, sending a bolt of bright yellow electricity shoot up into the sky for a few moments before dissipating. The remains of Vort slowly flaking away into golden motes of light as the armor wrenched his axe free of the opposing berserker. The Dragon Slayer armor and the Smelter Demon turned to each other, engaging in a small staring contest before glancing off in opposing directions. The Dragon Slayer armor stared off in the direction of his master while the Smelter Demon glared down the street towards the group still battling Freya. Their new objectives in sight, the two sprinted off towards their quarry. Master Group Pav. Berserker is on his way here. Olga informed Ritska. The boy would have let out a minor sigh of relief if he wasn't so tense right now, and he couldn't be blamed for his emotion either. Lancer moved with grace that someone of his stature and apparel had no right possessing. That was his general consensus as he watched the enemy servant move. Gundyr reared back his right elbow, then slammed it into Mash's shield. The girl let out a gasp as she staggered backwards, right before Gundyr twisted his body, flowing with the motion of the strike and sending his left hand rocketing upwards in a vicious uppercut into the right cross of the shield. His continued attempts to break her guard had left her with no opportunity to attempt a counter-attack. Not that she could. His strength had seemingly tripled once his eyes turned red, something she could only attribute to a high-class skill or a noble phantasm. How long it would last, however, was something she didn't know. Use your mystic code uniform. Olga hissed at him. Help her. How? You haven't showed me yet. Ritska shot back, his nervousness overriding his sense of concern as it hadn't factored into him who he was speaking to. Olga didn't comment on it as she was feeling a similar degree of concern at watching Mash get manhandled by the servant. Mash! Beatrice cried out as she sprinted towards the pair. Activate your shield. Not wasting time for a second, she nodded her head. Lord Chaldeas. The blue light expanded out in front of her. Gundyr's fist was violently recoiled as he attempted to punch through again. Growling in annoyance only to realize that someone was behind him. Elements coalesce. Beatrice cried out as she held her catalyst aloft. The spirit cries and rages. My magic burns all. Blue rays of light began to form around the head of her staff as she pulled it back. Gundyr swung around and made to charge at her before she thrust the staff forwards. Soul Storm. The staff was silent for a second. Then it screamed. A titanic beam of bright blue energy shot forth from the tip of the catalyst, engulfing Gundyr as he sprinted at the caster, the power behind the attack blasting him backwards before he slammed into Mash's shield. The force of being crushed between two noble phantasms began to get to him as he attempted to drag himself up. Still holding on, Beatrice continued to force magical energy into the beam. Then Gundyr took a single step forwards. Then another. Then another. In any other situation, Ritska would have admitted it to be awe-inspiring. In this one, however, it was a nightmare. Watching as the Lancer seemingly powered through the noble phantasm, even as parts of his armor began to glow due to the extreme heat, however he paid it no mind as he continued to advance on Beatrice with steady progress. Beatrice's face slowly morphed into one of horror as the beam gradually died down. Gundyr dropped to one knee, the armor along his chest glowing bright red as the hiss of steam escaped him, the air around his body visibly shifting due to the heat. Then his helmet slowly trailed up to stare at the caster. His eyes glowed bright red as he shot forth. Only for 3 arrows to bury themselves in the back of his right knee, in between the plates of armor. Gundyr staggered forwards, turning his head to look over in the direction the arrows came from, holding up his forearm to block his eye ports as several more collided with his body, chipping away at the plates of armor. Beatrice took that as her cue to back away as fast as she could. Gundyr made to stand up before Sif pounced on him from the front. The lancer lashed out as he gripped the hilt of the greatsword aimed at his throat with his left hand as his right grabbed the scruff of the wolf's neck, trying to hold him back from severing his head, the blade digging into the dirt next to his neck as the wolf attempted to drag it further. Gundyr slammed his knee into Sif's ribs, throwing the wolf off his body. Rising to his feet once again, Sif rolled to their feet, facing the lancer while growling, teeth snarled back as they shifted the blade in their mouth. Gundyr prepared his stance to battle the woe. Ha! Came the cry directly to his left before Gareth barreled into him, sending the lancer reeling as he was ragdolled across the ground, rolling up only to be struck in the torso with the lance again, the explosion blasting him away as Gareth continued to chase him down, repeatedly striking him with the lance and tearing away more and more chunks of his armor before she thrust her lance forwards a final time. Ira lupus. The lance gored the lancer through, tearing a hole through the center of his chest and out the back of his body before it exploded outwards, blasting him away from her and rolling into a heap on the ground. Gareth slumped her shoulders, her face bruised and bloodied as a trail of the red liquid dribbled out of her nose and mouth. The enemy lancer lay on the ground, a hole in his chest the size of a melon. She felt her eyes widen as she heard the hiss of his breath as he slowly sat back up, metal plates shifting as he, quite literally, pushed himself back to his feet. What the hell? Olga breathed out, her own eyes widening at the sigh. Is it battle continuation? That's a thing. Ritska parroted, stepping back. Romani's face flashed up, looking unusually serious. That servant's spirit origin is fading, but their strength is still there. The wound is definitely fatal, but he probably won't go down for a little while longer. He sighed. Talk about determined. Not now, doctor. Olga hissed at the man. Are you truly so stubborn? Nero cried out as she rushed towards the lancer, sliding to a halt next to Gareth. You are beaten. Do not cause yourself more pain. I have been commanded to kill you, the enemy lancer growled out, his voice pained yet still emotionless. I shall do that. Or die trying. He took a single step forwards, soon followed by another as he marched towards them, stopping as he caught sight of his halberd, moving over to it before ripping it from the ground and facing the group again. Hunching his body over, he shot off towards them, the hole in his chest seemingly doing nothing to cut down on his speed as he appeared before Gareth and Nero within scarce few moments, raising the halberd above his head and swinging downwards. It collided with the round shield of the Dragon Slayer armor. The berserker bat the weapon aside before it reared back the shield arm and struck the lancer in the head with the edge of the metal shield. Lancer stumbled backwards, disorientated from the blow but not distracted enough to avoid the swipe from the axe that would have bifurcated him. Gundyr skated backwards, stabbing his halberd into the ground to halt his acceleration as he stared at the servants before him. The red in his eyes intensified as his body turned transparent at the edges. He's burning through his magical energy. Olga exclaimed in shock. Is he pushing himself that far? That's some crazy determination. Romani widened his eyes. Talk about giving 110%. Gundyr didn't respond as he wrenched the halberd free from the ground, glaring at the servants before he advanced towards them. Servants versus Freya Pav. Beams of bright purple light slammed into the side the armored spider. Freya paid them no heed as she continued to thrash around, reeling her head back before spitting out a wave of pale green liquid towards the servants in front of her. Ash and Solaire shot off in opposing directions as the fluid washed against the ground, releasing an ominous sizzle as the tiles and rubble began to melt upon contact. Acid. Ash called out as he slid to a halt, cocking back his arm and throwing another fireball towards the spider. The ball harmlessly dissipated off the plating. It spits acid. Fleeth from the plaza, lest thou be caught in mine attack. Gwyndolin's voice echoed out around the plaza square, A light came into existence as the god manifested himself a taller building. A glowing arrow manifested itself in his bow before he took aim towards the sky. The group got the idea of what he was attempting and quickly sprinted off. Freya made to follow before Gwyndolin continued on. O heretics swathed in dark! Thy sins be brought into the light. Repent in thy final moments. An eternal curse upon thee. He loosened the glowing arrow into the sky. Darkened clouds manifested above Freya's body. The spider looked up just as the god's voice echoed out again. Dark moonlight. The cloud exploded with energy as hundreds of glowing arrows rained down atop the spider, exploding upon contact with the armored plates. Freya let out a wail of pain as the stone skin began to chip and burn away as the divine nature of the arrows scorched at the plates. The arrows of light intensified and soon consumed the spider's form in a cloud of smoke. The group slowly came to a stop, turning around to see the cloud of ash blast apart from Freya's scream as she shot a beam of light towards Gwyndolin. The Lord scowled, waving his hand and forming a golden shield in front of him. The beam crashed into the construct, reflecting along the surface at an angle as it lanced away up the street. Sullivan would have widened his eyes if he had them as he threw his body to the side not moments before the beam of energy split the path he had been standing on in half. Line of impact glowed before exploding outwards, blasting the pontiff into the air. He grunted as he glided back to ground. Gwyndolin's expression became strained as his construct began to crack under the continued barrage of the spider. Part of the golden shield splintered away and vanished into a cloud of dust. Lucian leapt into the air, slinging forth a whip as he latched around the spider's leg. Freya's eyes instantly locked onto him as she cut off power to the breath attack and raised her leg into the air to shake the hunter off. Only to freeze when something gripped it, eyes trailing down to see the black armor of the smelter demon grappling with the limb. Gwyndolin waved his arm. Large golden chains erupted from the ground, wrapping themselves around the spider's limbs and halting their movement. His hand outstretched in a grabbing motion, Gwyndolin grit his teeth as the spider began to strain against his illusions. The sound of metal groaning filled the air as it thrashed around. Ash sprinted out of cover, closing the distance to the Freya's head. She noticed him, raised her head slightly and opening up her mouth. Ash widened his eyes as more of the acidic spit came spilling forth from its mouth, kicking off the ground. The saber leapt into the air above the spider as Lucian flipped himself up onto the leg, retracting his whip back into a cane before he sprinted along the leg and towards the joint. Ash landed atop the spider's head as it continued to thrash around. Raising the black sword above his head, he stabbed it downwards through the armored skull. Freya let loose a roar of pain and struggled harder against the restraints. Several of the golden links snapped and vanished into dust, freeing several of her legs as she attempted to push herself back up to her feet. Lucian manifested a cannon in his left arm, jamming the barrel into an exposed section of the joint in the leg and then fired. The quicksilver ball of lead obliterated the already damaged joint and split the limb off the body. Freya cried out in pain as the hunter jumped away. Watch out! The booming voice of Goff was soon accompanied by the giant steam rolling towards them, smashing through the outer wall and bulldozing through the remains of several houses as he made for the spider. Ash recognized his intent. Ripping the sword free from Freya's head, he turned away and jumped off, making sure to kick off the spider as hard as he could, denting the exoskeleton inwards. Freya attempted to rise again, only for Goff to jump onto her elbow first. The combined weight and strength of the giant traveling full speed landed on the midpoint of the two-headed spider. The magnified sound of shattering ceramic signified the armor of the beast being unable to withstand the sudden blow as it collapsed onto the street again. Goff lifted himself up, cocking back his fist before rocketing it downwards towards Freya's first head. The giant fist slammed into the skull and instantly turned it into a sticky green mess on the ground. Although the spider seemed more insulted than injured as the spider attempted to shift its body so as to face the giant with its other head. The remaining chains snapped as Freya hefted her body into the air, turning herself so her remaining head faced the giant. Goff lashed out with his hands, wrapping themselves around the spider's underplates and neck as it grappled with him. The two titans stumbled around as Freya raised her forward legs into the air, slashing them down through Goff's back. The archer grunted in pain but continued to grip the spider, even as one of the legs buried itself in his side under his ribs. The remaining head. Goff coughed out, shifting his arm to point the spider's head into the air as it attempted to stab him again. The servants took that as their cue and rushed the spider. Quelaag leapt upon its back, crawling upwards towards its face as she raised her burning sword above her head, a scowl on her face as she stared down at the spider's wide red eyes. Disgusting. She scoffed, thrusting the sword downwards through the spider's eyes. Freya let loose a shriek of pain before Quelaag ignited her sword in a pyromancy, sending a jet of fire through the sword and into the skull, pillars of fire shooting out the gaps in the plating from the inside as the spider continued to scream in pain. It slowly went limp, legs losing their power as they slumped over. The rider leapt off the spider and back to the ground, turning around and watching as Goff threw the corpse off him. The fell onto his back, groaning in pain from the wounds. That was a stupid thing for you to do. Quelaag was instantly by his side, berating him, "You're an archer. You think just because you're a giant you can suddenly grapple with every large beast. Huh." Goff released a chuckle in response, "Careful. Lady Quelaag, I might think thee worried for my health should thy sharp words continue to spill forth." Quelaag scoffed and crossed her arms, "If you're well enough to joke then you're not too badly hurt. Careless idiot, did you want to live up to those claims of giants being mindless brutes? Because your display certainly made you look the part. What happened to your bow?" "I misplaced it." "You what?" "Well, the hill fell. It slipped from my hands." "Are you clumsy then?" That's something new to me." Lucian muttered to Ash as the two watched the display with morbid curiosity. "To me as well." Ash nodded back to him, rubbing the back of his neck. "I did not think I would ever see a giant being spoken to in such a manner." "Nor did I," came Solaire's voice as he joined the others. "I suppose that is one for the stories." "Quite. 'Tis no surprise." The group turned their heads to see Gwyndolin materialize near them. Lady Quelaag was one of the few to regard Sir Goff with kindness, although it has always taken the form of a sharpened tongue. "Well," Lucian coughed. "You one of them gods." "I am unsure whether to be offended by thy crass manner of speech." Gwyndolin replied, not deigning to look at the man, "so I shall ignore it for now under these circumstances. Correct thy speech if thou wishes to continue this discussion." "Fuck you too then." Lucian grumbled under his breath, crossing his arms and looking away, "definitely a god." Ash looked around as he seemingly noticed something, whereas Sullivan. Something went flying from the hole where Freya had emerged. The green object slumped into the ground with a moan of pain, soon identifying itself as a person. The form of Sullivan soon joined it, landing next to the person on the floor, flicking his blade clean of the blood staining it. "Who is that?" Ash asked. Sullivan looked towards them, pointing down at the man. "The caster who summoned this thing." The pontiff replied, kicking the man. "I suspected we could extract information from him in regards to Aldrich's whereabouts." "I will tell you nothing," the caster spat out. "Heathen, degenerates." "Charming." Sullivan replied back, "And it is only a means of prolonging your life, the alternative is I simply kill you now." "Do it, then." "Well, that would be pointless while you still represent a means of information." Sullivan dismissed. "Really, while your attempts at bravery would normally be amusing, I have not the time to enjoy this display of yours." Reaching into his robe and withdrawing a small black gem. "I suppose it would be best to see if this works." He mumbled, then shoved it into the caster chest, eliciting a cry of pain from the man as he writhed around. Withdrawing his hand, Sullivan stared at him for several moments before nodding his head. "HMPH. It worked." "What did you just do?" Solaire asked, tilting his head to the side in confusion. Sullivan turned to him. "I crafted a replica of a separation crystal." It should have broken his link to Aldrich, the saint can no longer summon him back. Won't he disappear without magical energy? Quote. I suppose he will. Sullivan mused, looking back down at Castor, although I suspect he can last perhaps an hour, more than enough time to retrieve the information we need. Quote. What in the pit's name happened here? A voice cried out. The plaza turned to see Vrindari and the remnants of the Roman legion behind him. Cecilia held bridal style in the copy of Ashen overlooking the carnage. Quote. Pest control. Quelaag snorted back. Where's the night girl in that anyway? Fighting a lancer still. Ash responded, casting his eyes over to the smelter demon as it stood near the corpse. Is Vort dead? He called out to it. The berserker turned to him, nodding once. Well, that's one less problem. Master Group Pav. Gundyr stumbled back from another blow. The dragon slayer armor charged him, slamming its shield into his torso and sending him skating away. He looked up. Only Yo block a strike from the burning sword of Nero. Grunting, he flicked her away from him. The red-dressed woman flipped through the air before landing with a disturbing degree of grace. Sif rushed towards the side of the lancer. Gundyr spun his halberd towards the wolf head. Mash parried the blow upwards as the great sword of Artorias cut through his left limb. The lancer dropped down to the ground with a thud and minute cry of pain. Making to swing his halberd again, only for the berserker servant to slam a kick into his chest and blast him away, the halberd flying from his hands and burying itself in the ground far from him. Panting heavily, Gundyr attempted to rise up before Gareth stabbed her lance through his shoulder, pinning him to the ground. The lancer released a cry of pain as he reached towards the young girl, only for the burning blade of Nero to sever his arm at the elbow. He released a cry of pain as he fell back, the dragon slayer armor stamping down on his chest and denting the armor inwards. Gundyr panted, too weak to move or do much of anything. He merely remained on the ground releasing pained breaths every few moments. We got him. Ritska asked the group. Nero span around to face him with a wide smile. Indeed, Tribune, no, indeed Prefect. She announced, beaming at him before turning to Olga. And you, Pale Rose, you have risen to the rank of Tribune. Well done. Congratulations, Director. Romani snickered, you're going far in Roman society. Quiet. Olga scowled at him. Lancer. She called to the downed servant, where is your master? Gundyr remained silent. Gareth shook her head and looked over to her. He won't say anything. He's one of those, obey every command, types but to the extreme. Even Big Brother Gawain wasn't this bad. She cringed, staring down at him. Best if we kill him now. Quote. Very well. Olga nodded her head, turning to her servant, Berserker. That was all the command she needed. The Berserker servant exerted more pressure on the chest piece, pushing down with enough force to crush the chest cavity entirely with a creak of metal and a sputtering from the lancer. That being the final noise he made before his breathing ceased and he began to float away into motes of light. Confirming Lancer spirit origin disappearance. Romani called through the communicator, whatever was happening in city is over too. Good. Ritska let out a sigh of relief. I didn't really want to fight a giant spider. Nero nodded. I understand, they are quickly becoming horrifying to stare at. Chaldean Group Pav. We lost half of our strength in this. Vespasian announced as the physician finished tying a bandage around his head, covering up the wound on the left side of his face, at least, so far anyway. No more than 2,000 men left, my emperor. Nero gave a grim nod. Was a fearsome battle indeed. City will take years to repair the damage. The man grunted, narrowing his one eye. Heard we caught a prisoner though. Yeah, Ritska nodded, the caster behind the whole spider thing. I think Vrindari recognized him and has been conducting the interrogation. Although he doesn't have long. Romani winced through the screen. Is it that bad? I haven't been near them. Ritska shook his head. Vrindari is, probably torturing him. Are you alright with that? PFF'd. Ritska released a mirthless scoff. No. I'm away from them right now because I know if I was there, I'd probably put a stop to it. I don't like it, I really don't like it. Romani nodded his head, a non-judgmental expression on his face. If you don't like the idea of torture, Fujimaru-kun, it means you're still a good person. I admit, I'm not too big a fan of the idea either. I think it's because, well, Vrindari said that the spiders were all his, and given what has been happening to everyone living here, he cringed. It's fine, Fujimaru-kun. But I'm surprised that the enemy master hasn't recalled him yet. Apparently Sullivan used some kind of crystal to damage his summoning and connection to his master. Ritsuka rubbed the back of his neck. That was all I could understand from what Ash told me. He had something like that. Said he had been working on it since he got here. Ritsuka shrugged, and there was no guarantee it would work, so he said not to rely on it. Olga sighed, rubbing the bridge of her nose. I suppose it is to be expected. Something that can disrupt the summoning of a servant isn't exactly an item that can be crafted spontaneously. How long does the caster have left? 10, 20 minutes maybe. Tell your servant to keep working on him. Olga ordered. If it fails, we'll have Da Vinci run her tests on the ley lines here to see where they are being drained to. The armored fist cracked against Castor's cheek. Seldora's head snapped to the side. All those lives in the cove. All those miners. And for what? Vrindari scoffed. So you could betray the king for vermin. Tesseldora coughed. You may as well kill me already. I will tell you nothing. Why? Your master has abandoned you. Vrindari scoffed. Even if he had not, you would have been killed for this failure. You have lost, Duke Seldora. At least die with some small token of dignity. TCH, you could never understand my work. Seldora gave a chuckle. The beauty of it, the sheer depth. You're insane. Vrindari sneered, a madman led by a monster. What loyalty has inspired this? What have you to gain from denying my question? Quote. Simply, because I lost. Seldora coughed out. I lost against you, so I will be as petty as I wish. Pathetic. Vrindari shook his head, hand reaching for his sword, but if that is how you wish it. Ha! Seldora scoffed at him, his body breaking down into golden motes of light, as if I'd let you, he sneered at the shielder as he faded away, returning to the throne. Vrindari scowled behind his helmet. Saint Aldrich Pav. Wonderful. Lev clapped his hands sarcastically, truly, wonderful. All but one of your servants dead, and they'll probably discover where you are within the next day. Brilliant. I don't believe I've seen failure this spectacular since that halfwit in France. Aldrich growled, turning his body to glare at the man in green. Have care. The plan still had the chance for success. I need only enough power to break through the barrier. And they've just grabbed that extra power you need. Lev pointed out with a frown. This is what I get for listening though. I knew I should have picked a different servant, one who had at least a sliver of intellect and much less ego. You dare. Aldrich raged. I brought this empire to its knees in a matter of weeks. I shaped the deep according to my will. I will breach the barrier, gaining access to the deep, and I am about to bungle everything in half that time. Lev replied dryly. I had not believed it possible, but you are more useless than I could have ever imagined. I will be having words with that one about this entire fiasco. Aldrich remained silent as he glared down at Lev for a few moments. I lack the power to open up the door to the abyss. Yes. We have covered this. I know. Aldrich agreed easily, which is why I am going to rectify this issue. Oh. And how are you planning on doing that? By consuming a new source of power. And where are you going to find that in your infinite wisdom? Not to worry. Aldrich reassured him. It's very close at hand. And took a while, but my next chapter is done. Yep, these chapters are all going to generally be longer than they used to be. Between 6 to 10k words from now on. Excluding servant dialogue. Because this singularity really has gone on for a while, hasn't it? Christ. Babylonia and Camelot are going to be long as all hell if I don't get that sorted out. Anyway, I've decided that the next Singularity, we're going to have a pretty even mix of souls and fate servants because this one was heavily souls-centric. Which is a shame because Boudica got shooed out. So we'll make it up to everyone's favorite redhead big sister. In other news, 40 chapters in. Yay!